The word communism comes from the word commune. What does this have to do with chapter 7? Now, what I'm about to tell you, folks, is not in the book. However, the North American Indians, at the time the Europeans began arriving, were communists. How do I say that? They lived in villages or communes, and they had the nearest thing to communism we've seen. They had no money, no social classes, everybody very egalitarian, very little trade, and to me their cultural level was zero. They have been called uncivilized. They have also been called some other uncomplimentary names, including savages. Anyway, this was what they were looked down on by Europeans who came over and met them. But these Indians had descended from Indians who had more on the ball than the ones that the Europeans met. How many of you have ever been to the Etowah Indian mounds? Same response had the other class, only about one or two of you. I was just there about 2 weeks ago, and I told my wife, hey, I'm going to be teaching on this. At one time, apparently, they had a social structure. Now, the Indians who built the Etowah Indian mounds were not communist in that they had a social hierarchy. They had a person at the top, you might call it king, and under him were deputies called nobles. They had classes, they had trade. Some of the stuff we find in the mounds had to have come all the way from California, some from as far away as Wisconsin, and some from Florida. They had trade, and apparently they had some kind of economic system. But over time, a new idea took hold, communism. Now, I don't want to imply that I think they were evil because they were communists. The word communist conjures up Marx and Lenin, Marxist-Leninists. No, the Americans were not Marxist-Leninist communists per se, in that they never heard or read Marx and Lenin. They simply were misdirected, misguided into thinking that, hey, this is the solution to all of our problems. We'll get rid of our social classes, we'll get rid of our money, we'll have no wealth, we'll all be equal, we'll have no private ownership of property, all the land will belong to everyone. And the result was their cultural level went to, how should I say it? Their cultural level went to zero. Or near zero. Now, it was supposed to bring about peace. Now, there was, when the Europeans first arrived, there was one old Indian, yes, they had a few who lived to be nearly 100, who told the European visitors that we believed that we could create a society that had peace and equality. Instead, the society we created went into poverty. We had numerous wars. We had to abandon all of our fine buildings, our fine structures, and go out and live in the woods and live in teepees and wigwams. This is where communism led them, and to me, it's where it will lead us if we embrace it. It sounds like a big solution to the economic problem. Everybody will be equal. Everybody will be no private ownership of property, no money, nobody then will be poor. Instead, it impoverishes everyone. All right. Having opened up with that, where did the American Indians initially come from? The standard theory, as given in your book, and as we've heard for a couple hundred years now, is that they were Mongolians living here in Mongolia, China, and possibly Japan and Korea. And some of them drifted upward into northern Siberia. During the Ice Age, they could walk across over the ice, walk across Siberia, and go into Alaska. And from Alaska, over hundreds and thousands of years, they fanned out and spread all over the Americas. The ice melted. They never went back to Asia. That's the standard theory. It cannot be proven. And one of the problems with it is that every Indian who seemed to know where they had come from always said Oh, we came across the ocean in boats. The ocean might have been the Pacific, it might have been the Atlantic. Interestingly enough, the American Indians were not a seagoing people. Oh yeah, it's true, these people living here did use small boats to visit around these islands, but they generally were not a seagoing people. As far as we know, once they arrived and never crossed the ocean. Now, it has been proven more than once, you can cross the ocean in an 18-foot rowboat. You can even cross the Pacific. All you need is some dried up food that will serve, that will not spoil, dried food, a little bit of water, and you can cross the Atlantic in a rowboat or even a small ship. They believe, the ones of them who had any idea where that they came from, they believe they crossed either one of these oceans and set up in society here. And if you really read some far out books, folks, there's one called America BC that states that some of the Indians at least were Jews who came over during the Babylonian captivity, and that they had writing, and they had 3 kings in a row named Israel, Israel 1, Israel 2nd, and Israel 3rd. Again, all kinds of theories. Now, one of the more interesting theories that has a lot of basis in reality, the Olmec Indians, a very, very old tribe of Indians, actually a tribe, that settled here in near Mexico City, initially came from Africa. Why do we think so? They depict tigers, which are not found in North America and haven't been in many a year. They depict tigers in their artwork. Their features of their masks, they had face masks, and their features were very, very African type features. And if we could just do a DNA test on some of their bodies, if we could ever find enough of their bodies to have some intact DNA, we might prove that they actually were African. But the Olmec, one of the first civilizations were built on the North American continent, and it appears that they were African in origin. All right. The Olmec civilization built big cities, at least one really big city and large temple. Now, I want to elaborate farther on that. Today, this part of North America seems to be the most advanced, most developed. Well, I'm going to include Canada in that. The United States and Canada, the most developed, the most advanced. Before Columbus, the most advanced part of the Americas was this area right in here. Central America and Mexico. And this part declined. Today it's a lot reversed. This part is in the state of, it's not as nearly as advanced as this here. Why the turnabout? Again, that's for the subject for another topic, another day. These Olmecs built a civilization and then declined. Now, folks, this is what we gather from our study of Indians. When you start talking about the history of the Indians, you don't talk about great names like Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar, because they didn't leave many written records, and we do not know who the names of their chieftains were. In most cases, we don't know who the names even of their kings were. It was like they were nameless tribes. But what we do know from our study of archaeology is they would have big cities, a lot of trade, a civilization that would come, appear for a while, and then vanish. In its place would come another civilization. It would appear for a while and then vanish. The Olmecs were no exception. Where are the Olmec Indians today? We don't know. This may surprise you, but in the fights that go on between civilized and uncivilized, who knows who usually wins? Uncivilized. Excellent, Tyler. Uncivilized. Why is that? Your civilized who tend to become soft. Now, in the case of the Indians, when Europeans came over and fought the Indians, And I have to rate a lot of the Indians as being uncivilized. I have to, but just simply by the historical fact. That was an exception. The Europeans wound up winning, and the uncivilized people wound up being driven off their land and losing. That was an exception. But, and I'm going to talk next time about why I think this was. But in the case of most cases throughout history, when civilized man battles uncivilized, the uncivilized wind up winning. Does that have any application for us today? Yes. Go ahead.
I'm not going to offend anybody today.
You-
I'm not going to offend anybody today.
Okay, well, here's my take on it. It looks like the world is about to do war with a group of people who might have to call uncivilized. And for all I know, the uncivilized can win. I'm not going to say that they will, they'll have to, but they can win. And I'm talking about October 6th, 2014, not sometime in the past. Uncivilized people have fought down civilizations many a time in history. And why that is, a lot of time because of civilized people try to become too civilized to fight, too civilized to get their hands dirty, you might say, while the uncivilized fight dirty. That's part of it. Anyway, the Olmec civilization gave way to a group of people who started off as being uncivilized, the Aztecs. The Aztecs appear to have started somewhere here around the North Mexico region and worked their way down and conquered what little was left of the Olmec Empire, or if there was anything left. But anyway, they took over and set up their capital in what is today Mexico City and developed a fairly moderately high level of civilization. And these were the people who the Europeans met when the Europeans first went into Mexico. Now, it is believed that the Olmec and the Aztecs and the Mayans who were to come after, all three of these groups, practiced human sacrifice. It was part of their religion. They believed that this would appease their gods. Now, in the case of the Aztecs, they were trying to appease their sun god. They believed if the sun god was not fed, he would become angry and come down and devour them. So they would sacrifice a few of their own people, and these sacrifices would feed the sun god and keep it from becoming angry. All right. Again, the Aztecs were farmers also. Most of their, from what we know about their livelihood, it was mostly farming. But they had a civilization. They had, and civilization means social classes, which they had. They were probably in a state of decay already when the Europeans finally arrived, led by General Hernando, I'm trying not to call him General, led by Cortez. All right. Having said that, before I go on to the Maya, I'm going to leave the Maya for another day. I want to state this about the American Indians in general. They did not have any large animals for them to domesticate, except for these Indians here had the llama. That is, they didn't have the horse, they didn't have the donkey, didn't have the ox, didn't have the camel, didn't have cows, didn't have pigs, didn't have sheep, didn't have goats. What did they have? Mostly game animals. They had the buffalo, but they did not attempt to tame the buffalo and herd them. But they did have the deer, the elk, the moose, the buffalo, and on farther south. Speaking of buffalo, the skeletons of the buffalo we find from from thousands of years ago tend to show that one time the buffalo was as large as today's elephants. Very, very huge. And the plants, the Indians did not have oats, wheat, corn, rye, and maybe they didn't have oats and wheat and barley and rye. You might say the grasses. Now they did have corn, they did have squash, they did have a few types of beans. They had tapioca, some of them did. They taught mankind how to grow corn. The original corn growers grew corn, it's believed, here in Guatemala, but it might have been here in Mexico, and from there it fanned out all over the west, well, much of the Western Hemisphere, and from there Europeans took it up and it fanned out all over Europe. Corn is one of the cheapest plants to grow, and if you visit the Midwest, you will find acres and acres and acres of cornfields. Unfortunately, it's not the most nutritious food you can eat. But then there was the Indians being cut off from the rest of humanity did not have a lot of things that the rest of humanity had. They had the dog. They didn't have the cat. They did have the dog. None of them had ever invented the wheel. Maybe because they didn't need to. They probably could have and they needed to, but they generally didn't have roads that would be conducive to for use by a wheel, by wheel vehicles. So they did a lot of their walking on foot, and except for the llama here in what is today Peru, they didn't have pack animals. So what you have here, and we'll end with this, you have two sides of the Atlantic, folk. Each of them growing up, you might say, developing without being aware of the other side. Inevitably, these two sides were going to meet. And the one side was going to wind up being conquered and swallowed up. You might say, why was this inevitable? Because human nature is what human nature is. And we have been learning just in the past week or so, a couple of weeks, human nature appears to not have changed, no matter how much we might think it has. We're still the same we always were. If you think that, oh, no group can conquer us, and I had a person in my spring class, sat right here on the front row, he said the United States cannot be conquered. Most of the class didn't seem to agree with him. If you believe that, I say go on living in your dream world. There are people living in this world who'd be eager to come right in and take away everything we have and leave us with nothing. And I'm not going to say they won't or can't do it. Given just a few more blunders on our part and a few more steps of good fortune on theirs, they can. It's happened before when a group of people came from Europe, took away all the Indians' lands, drove them away, conquered them, enslaved them, and subjugated them. Happened before. And yes, it can happen again. We'll talk about next time how it happens and why.